Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. These were reportedly the final words said by Jane Stanford. Quote, "I have been poisoned. This is a terrible death to die." Jane Stanford, who lived in a mansion on Nob Hill in San Francisco, was murdered by poisoning in Hawaii in 1905. She, along with her husband, Leland Stanford, founded Stanford University. Leland Stanford himself, long dead by the time of Jane Stanford's murder, was a railroad tycoon and former governor of California and a senator. My guest today argues that there were many who wanted Jane Stanford dead, and even more who wanted to help cover it up. The case has been never officially solved. The story of her murder is also about power and wealth in the Gilded Age. My guest for this conversation is Richard White. He is the author of the book Who Killed Jane Stanford? A Gilded Age Terror of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University. Richard White is the Margaret Byrne Professor of American History Emeritus at Stanford University. Richard White, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
I'm glad to be here, Mitch. Thanks.
We're obviously going to there's also a history of Stanford University itself. So let's begin there. Stanford's founded in 1885, again by both Jane and Leland Stanford, in the memory of their son, who we'll talk about in a moment. But I just want to begin because I think this is important to know about Stanford University at this time, and almost the first half of its existence up to now. Stanford is not this powerhouse university that we'd recognize today.
Now, Stanford's a West Coast liberal arts college for all practical purposes. It'd be the equivalent today of the Claremont colleges. It's not a major research university, though it aspired to be a major research university. And it's also reputed at the time to be the wealthiest university in the country. And indeed, it will become one of the wealthiest universities in the country once Jane and Leland Stanford are dead. But until then, the endowment that the university controls is relatively small. And for all practical purposes, Jane Stanford owns Stanford University. And the older she gets, the more she acts as if everybody in that university is her employee. And in a sense, they were.
So you already put a clue out there. Have become a wealthier school after Jane Stanford's death. But really, the Stanford that we recognize today doesn't really come about until about the 1950s, sort of the Cold War?
Yeah. It's a creation of the federal government. It comes after World War II, and it's pretty much when Stanford turns heavily towards technology and engineering. I mean, not science, but technology and engineering. And it manages to tap a lot of Cold War money, which is going into research, and that's what makes it a major school. Before that, no, it's pretty much, as I say, a local regional college.
Give me some context in understanding the Stanfords. And let's begin with Leland Stanford, really powerhouse figure in California history, even though I suspect most people don't know who Leland Stanford was.
Yeah, that's the irony. Most people would not know the name Stanford except for the university. But Stanford was one of the Big Four, as they were called at the time, the people who founded the Central Pacific Railroad, which in turn became the Southern Pacific Railroad, and was one of the major corporations at the time. Leland Stanford Sr. Was powerful largely because he was partners with powerful men, particularly Collis P. Huntington. Huntington came to despise Stanford, thought he was incompetent, self-indulgent, and not the sharpest tool in the shed. And there's a lot of evidence that goes towards that. But Stanford and his partners had merged their money. And once they merged their money together in these corporations, and these corporations were fairly shady in their financial dealings, there was no way they could ever get rid of each other. And they stayed partners until they gradually died off.
It's interesting. I oftentimes, and I like talking about the history of the railroads and the rail industry in this period of time, and oftentimes compare it to this very moment in time with the tech industry and the tycoons of the tech industry. And of course, Stanford is a part of this story, this modern story of the tech industry, but Leland Stanford was very much a part of this previous railroad industry period of time.
And the parallels are very, very strong. I mean, one of the things that struck me about the railroad corporations is going to be relatively late in their existence before they make a lot of money. But these guys pioneer corporations which themselves lose money, very often lose their stockholders' money, very often fail to pay their debts, and yet make the people who run them immensely wealthy. And that's the story of the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific.
And the railroads changed life in similar ways. I mean, obviously very different things, but in similar ways as the internet and the tech industry has changed life today. It made everything accessible.
Yeah, one of the things that they do is that once they're there, it's impossible to imagine life without them. You might hate the people who run them. You might be frustrated by them, but there's no going back. And the railroads in that way were transformative. And the people who run them know that, and they are able to make a great deal of money because of that.
Would we consider Leland Stanford to be one of the robber barons? And what does that mean? I know you're a history of this period.
Yeah, I always try to avoid using robber barons. They're certainly going to be called that. And the reason I avoid using it is the robber barons make it sound as if these guys are competent. No, these guys aren't competent. These guys are very, very rich, and they're very, very corrupt, and they're able to bring in subsidies and get away with things which should have placed them in a penitentiary. But are they adroit businessmen? No, most of them aren't. If they're adroit businessmen, their companies would not have gone bankrupt as often as they do. These railroads go bankrupt constantly. Very often they provide very poor service. They're overly competitive. They've overbuilt them. So they're rich and they're robbers. But the barons part, I think that connotes a kind of power and a kind of intelligence that most of them did not possess.
It gives them too much credit.
Too much credit, yeah.
Instead of landing in a penitentiary, Leland Stanford lands in the governor's office.
He lands in the governor's office, and again, he has a very mixed record there. Leland Stanford was essentially a saloon keeper who's in partnership with Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. And what they do is decide it'd be useful to have one of them heading the Republican Party and running the government in Sacramento. And that gets Leland Stanford made governor. Before that, his attempts at local office had been travesties. He loses by thousands and thousands of votes. But he ends up being governor, and as governor, he's a Republican. And he's a Republican during the Lincoln administration, so that gives him certain power. But mostly what he's increasingly being remembered for now, that was glossed over, is Stanford is in charge of a policy towards Native Americans in California, which I do not use the word genocide loosely. I don't think most American Indian policy was genocidal. California was genocidal. And Leland Stanford was the one who really administers that.
I think of Benjamin Medley's book, American Genocide, that lays out
and that's
that
the one that really drives that home.
Yeah. And Leland Stanford is an important player in this history?
He is, because he's the one who essentially does what he often does. He gets money that finances bounties and that equips what are essentially Indian hunters, disguises them as if they're the California militia. Disguises is probably too strong. They were the California militia, but they were also Indian hunters. And presides over what is going to be this sort of genocidal campaign of violence that goes on into the 1860s.
Do you think this is his legacy as governor?
It's really hard to get around it. People try to move around it in other ways, but mostly people say, well, he kept California in the Union, and he was governor while California stayed in the Union. That's true, but you can't gloss over this other part of it.
Obviously, our conversation is going to be focused more on Jane Stanford than Leland Stanford, but of course, Jane Stanford's there for all of this. Is she? How would you describe? We're going to talk about Jane Stanford as sort of basically owning Stanford University and being in control of Stanford University after Leland Stanford dies. But what's important to know about Jane Stanford before this period?
Before this period, I mean, both Jane and Leland Stanford have modest educations. So they're people founding a university who are not highly educated people. And Jane Stanford will actually stay in New York for a couple of years while Leland goes west with the gold rush, starts his businesses in Sacramento, and only come out after that. She is a woman who never expected to find herself wealthy, but she found herself wealthy. She's also a woman who never expected to have a child, because they tried to have a child, but it's only relatively late in their marriage that she conceives Leland Stanford Jr. And at that point, she becomes a doting mother. That Leland Stanford Jr. is a precocious child. He's spoiled. They take him to Europe. He meets the Pope. He meets French artists. Every sort of whim he has is indulged. And so she focuses her life on that child. And the really affecting thing about Jane Stanford is the grief, the overwhelming grief when Leland Stanford Jr. dies. It looked as if it would kill both her and Leland. And what they recover from that is their ideal that their son has died, and Leland Stanford Jr., which we come to later, appears in his father's dream, and the end outcome of all of this is going to be the founding of Leland Stanford Jr. University. But there's no understanding Jane Stanford without the birth of Leland Stanford Jr., and there's also no understanding Stanford University without that sort of legacy. And one of the most revealing questions I ever had from an undergraduate when I was teaching at Stanford, I used to give these campus tours, was she asked, as we were down at the mausoleum, the tomb where all three are buried, she asked if Leland Stanford Jr. had been a girl rather than a boy, would there be Stanford University? And I thought about it, and I thought, no, it wouldn't. Stanford University would vanish from the landscape. It would just be another tract of suburbs stretching south from San Francisco, because what Leland Stanford Jr. did was allow the Stanford name to go on. And that is one of the things that comes out of this. Stanfords are remembered because of the university, and the university is only remembered because having Leland Stanford Jr. there is the legacy that they were going to have. If he had lived, he would have gone on to inherited the corporations, but instead he becomes the namesake of the university.
And the actual name of the university is Leland Stanford Jr. University.
People forget it all the time. It's Leland Stanford Jr. University.
He dies at 15, at the age of 15, typhoid fever, I think.
Yeah, which is common at the time.
It's interesting, and I think this is an important distinction. It's not that the Stanfords wanted to create a university and now were naming the university after their son who had died. They created the university because their son had died.
They created it because their son had died, and beyond that, because their son appeared to Leland Stanford Jr., Leland Stanford Sr. in a dream. The association of Stanford with ghosts, with spiritualism, is very, very strong. And that Leland Stanford Jr. would continue to send messages, according to his mother, up until her death. So Leland Stanford Jr. University is inspired by a dream from a dead person, and it will continue to be run on the advice of dead people. First, Leland Stanford Jr., and after that, Leland Stanford Sr. Jane Stanford says she consults with them regularly.
She's a spiritualist.
She's a spiritualist. And the essence of spiritualism in the late 19th century, and it comes out of its strength, is because of the number of children who die. I mean, it's mostly focused on the death of children, not the death of adults. So if a husband or wife or a lover dies early, they too will appear. But it's mostly children. And this immense grief finds its outlet in spiritualism. And what spiritualism amounts to in the late 19th century is the ability to communicate with the dead. That was the essence of it.
And she is consulting both with her son and her husband, who by this time they're both dead, about getting consultation on how to run the university. You already said that. I just really want to hammer this point because it's not what you usually think of with Stanford University.
No, you don't think of most universities as run by ghosts, but Stanford University is run by ghosts. And it makes Stanford an object of ridicule to the great embarrassment of its president, David Starr Jordan, because while spiritualism is strong, it is also the source of a great deal of controversy and a great deal of ridicule. So there is, among other colleges and universities in the United States, a great deal of derision about Stanford University. It's seen as something of an outlier and as an embarrassment. And the things that happen there, other universities try to say, no, that's not how we work. This is a very peculiar place. And they were right. It was a very peculiar place.
Stanford, what's Stanford, the university today? What's its creation story? How does it tell the story?
The creation story erases everything I've just told you. The creation story is that Leland and Jane Stanford will keep this part. They'll keep the part that they were overwhelmed at the grief of their son. And what they decide to do is that since they no longer have a child, they're going to devote their fortune to the good of the children of California. And the good of the children of California is going to be to start a university which will endow with their fortune. And that Stanford uses this as a way, essentially, not to be too crass, but it's crass enough, is as a fundraising opportunity. Stanford's give the example of what you should do with your money. You should take the money, you should leave it for this larger good. The money goes into the university, which has now risen to be one of the great universities in the world. And the story is told as a sort of inspiration to donors as to the proper use of fortunes. I mean, it's sort of Andrew Carnegie, Gilded Age stuff. But in fact, that's not really what Leland Stanford did with his fortune, but that's a story I imagine we'll come to.
But they've suppressed the rest of it. Actively suppressed, or?
Yeah, they actively suppressed. The cover-up of Jane Stanford's death is going to be orchestrated by the university. They have never in 100 years since then talked about what happened to Jane Stanford and their own efforts in making sure that they had a very different version of what went on. And they never really talk about the problems with early Stanford's endowment or its very mixed record towards academic freedom.
I feel like at this point I better ask you about the death and the murder. There was actually, she died of poisoning in 1905 in Hawaii. She was on her way to Japan, but there's actually a previous attempt on her life.
Yeah, she's on her way to Japan because somebody tried to poison her in San Francisco. She had gone to bed in her mansion on Nob Hill, which she shared with her servants and with Bertha Byrne, who was her personal secretary and companion. And somebody put rat poison, which contains strychnine, in her Poland Spring bottled water. Whoever was doing it was not very good at being a poisoner because they put too much in. She immediately gagged, began to throw up, called in the maid. They washed it out, got her to vomit. So the first poisoning is going to fail. She doesn't even initially know that it's been poisoning, but they send it out to have the water analyzed, and it comes back saying, somebody has just put a copious amount of rat poison into your Poland Spring bottled water, and somebody was trying to kill you through strychnine poisoning. At that point, what they're going to do is they're going to call in private detectives. They never go to the police, and that's common in the Gilded Age. The idea is to cover up the scandal, to make sure this doesn't get to the newspapers, which works for a few weeks, but after that it gets into the papers, and also to conduct a private investigation to try to find out who had put the poison in the water. Meanwhile, they decide that it's unsafe for Jane Stanford to stay in San Francisco, so she decides to go to Japan, stopping off in Hawaii. And among people close to her, she's very open about what's happened to her. We have it in letters about what's happened to her. But it's still kept secret. It'll only come into the papers after she's departed. And then she'll go to Hawaii. In Hawaii, she takes Bertha Byrne and another maid, not one of the old maids from her mansion, with her. And after about a week in Hawaii, she goes out, has a picnic, comes back, has a light supper, is tired, asks Bertha Byrne to give her some bicarbonate of soda and some medicine before then. Bertha Byrne measures out the bicarbonate of soda. She doesn't take it right away. She goes to bed. And in the middle of the night, they hear her screaming for help. She has taken the bicarbonate of soda. And as it will turn out, there is strychnine in the bicarbonate of soda. But this isn't rat poison. This is pure strychnine, which is very, very hard to get. Given in a quite precise dose, if it had worked perfectly, and it nearly does, it would have been just enough to kill her, but would have left no trace in the bicarbonate, and they would have no reason to test the body to see what had happened to her. But this one works. She dies, as she says, a terrible death, because death by strychnine poisoning is an incredibly painful death. And one of the things that comes with it is you are acutely aware of what's happening to you. So Jane Stanford knows she's been poisoned. And as she says, it's a terrible death to die.
Yeah, that's why I said in the introduction, she's quoted to have said, "I have been poisoned. This is a terrible death to die." When I was writing that out, you're always trying to come up with a little clever intro to grab people's attention. I was wondering, I wonder if this is apocryphal that she said this.
No.
There
are numerous witnesses to her saying that. And like you, I usually say that's too good a thing for them to say, but no, that's what she says.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Richard White. Richard White is the author of the book, Who Killed Jane Stanford? A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University. Richard White is the Margaret Byrne Professor of American History Emeritus at Stanford University. So you mentioned two maids that traveled with her from San Francisco to Honolulu. One of them named Bertha Byrne, who plays a big part in this story. I guess it would just, and there's many people who are suspected of this murder, and you go through it all, and we'll span through that. But it just, on the face of it, well, Bertha Byrne basically was the only person who was with Jane Stanford, both in San Francisco when she was poisoned the first time, and then the second time in Honolulu.
Yeah, Bertha Byrne, she's not a maid. She's really more of a secretary and companion. And things look bad for Bertha Byrne when you're the only person present at both poisonings. But the argument that's made, and it's made by the president of the university, by members of the boards of trustees, by even some members of the Stanford family, they said, well, Bertha Byrne would have no motive for killing her. She and Bertha Byrne had been together since Bertha Byrne was 19 years old. Bertha Byrne had served her faithfully her whole life. Bertha Byrne stood to get far more money by having Jane Stanford alive than she'd ever get by Jane Stanford dying. That there was simply no rational reason for Bertha Byrne to really kill what, as they regarded it, the goose that laid the golden egg. That she would be better off just accompanying Jane Stanford. As I did more research, I found out virtually everything about that story was wrong. But that was the reason it was given at the time. It was just saying there had to be a motive, and this is the person with the least motive of anybody involved, even though they admit she's there both times.
Didn't Bertha Byrne also go on to write a biography about Jane Stanford?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the major sources about Jane Stanford. And Bertha Byrne will write this in the 1930s. This is 30 years after everything happened. And the biography is actually one of the things that gave me a lot of my clues to unraveling the mystery. And it's not that Bertha Byrne lied. There are times where she'd lie. It was that things that Bertha Byrne never talked about at all. And the worst thing you can do with the historian, probably the worst thing you can do with the detective, is to not say something that's critical to this story. Once you start leaving out things they can find independently, then you can begin to suspect the whole story and begin to wonder, why are you leaving things out? So the Bertha Byrne biography was immensely useful to me, not so much for what she said, but what she refused to talk about.
I mean, this whole story is strange. I mean, we began with the naming of Stanford University after Leland Stanford Jr., and then Jane Stanford communing with the dead to get consultation on how to run the university. And now we're talking about a potential person who committed murder, then writing the biography about that person.
No, it's not the usual thing murderers do. It would have been, by this time, it's 35 years later. I don't know what her motive for doing it was. By then, the people she cooperated with are largely dead. Maybe she did it for the money, but, in 1935, writing a biography of a woman most everybody has forgotten about is not going to bring in the big bucks. And as far as I know, this one never did. So, at some level, this story wouldn't let her go, even though she was now not going to be investigated, nor was anybody else, because the university had said Jane Stanford had died of natural causes. Why go back and bring all this stuff up again? But she does.
When you say the university helped cover up the murder, you're really talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but David Starr Jordan, who's the school's first president.
Yeah. What happens is once they've had strychnine poisoning in Hawaii, they have a coroner's jury. They convene a coroner's jury. And the coroner's jury, and they also do an autopsy, and they find traces of strychnine in her body. They find traces of strychnine in the bicarbonate of soda. And the coroner's jury decides she had died of strychnine poisoning at the hands of person or persons unknown. Hawaii at that time is a long way away from San Francisco. It takes several days to get there by steamship, and the steamship actually that David Starr Jordan is traveling on doesn't have radio contact, so he doesn't even know about the coroner's jury verdict until he gets there. As soon as he gets to Honolulu, he will set about, even as he denies he's setting about doing anything except retrieving the body, to overturn the coroner's verdict. He can't do that legally, but what he will do is use the Stanford Alumni Network to hire a doctor, Dr. Ernest Waterhouse, who he makes a deal with that he will re-examine the evidence around Jane Stanford's death. And to be clear here, Waterhouse never examined the body, did not take place in the autopsy. He did not attend the coroner's jury when they were looking at the body. He never had any direct examination of the bicarbonate or anything associated with the death, nor did he consult with any of the physicians, all of whom decided she had died of strychnine poisoning. He comes up with his own theory, and his theory was that she had gone out. She was an elderly woman. She had gone out on a picnic and overexerted herself, even though the day was 72 degrees and she rode a carriage all the way out there. She had eaten too much at lunch. The lunch had then given her gas. The gas had created pressure on her heart, and the pressure on her heart had then led to a bout of hysteria, which had triggered a heart attack, and she had died. By Waterhouse's theory, a fart would have saved her. I mean, all she had to do was release the gas. It's an absolutely ridiculous theory, which has no other support from anybody else. But that's what David Starr Jordan says has happened. He said it's a natural death. He said he can't do anything in Hawaii because they have their own stuff. When he gets back to San Francisco, he will release the Waterhouse report. He'll consult with the police. He'll consult with San Francisco officials. And within 24 hours, they say she died of natural causes, and that's that.
But the police in Honolulu were very clear that they thought this was a homicide.
Yeah. This was a homicide, yeah. But the thing is, Honolulu is a territory at the time. It's underfunded. One of the great fears in Honolulu is they're now going to have a murder trial of somebody who was very, very prominent. It's going to be bad publicity and very, very expensive. They say this is San Francisco's problem. This is a problem that came over with her on the ship. It started in San Francisco. Let the San Francisco police investigate it. So they were more than willing to wash their hands of it, but they never expected that, in fact, she would be said to have died a natural death.
This is a story that is also about San Francisco, Gilded Age San Francisco. We think of Stanford University in Palo Alto, but they lived in San Francisco. Leland Stanford was a significant figure in San Francisco.
Yeah, he was. I mean, Leland Stanford had his mansion in San Francisco. He controlled San Francisco politics in many ways until his death. And the people he'd worked with still controlled San Francisco politics until the roof machine, the labor machine, pushes them out. He's critical to the running of San Francisco, which is one of the most corrupt cities in the United States. And the other thing we forget too is that it was easier to get from Palo Alto to San Francisco in 1900 than it is now, because the railroad service is one thing the railroad did.
No Caltrans.
The trains would take you there in about 20 or 30 minutes, and they ran all the time. So Palo Alto and San Francisco are very, very tightly linked.
So that you could get back and forward quite easily.
Oh, yeah, very easily.
Yeah. I misunderstood what you said there for a moment, but yeah.
No, it's the link is there. I mean, Jane Stanford would regularly, at least on Sundays, get up in San Francisco and go to Palo Alto to attend services in the Memorial Church at Stanford.
You write that the corruption that Leland Stanford would help bring to San Francisco would inevitably, the same type of corruption would play a big role in why the San Francisco police did not properly investigate her murder.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ironies of the case. I mean, Leland Stanford corrupted politics in California and San Francisco. And he's widely denounced for it, him and Huntington. It's recognized at the time. But I think never in his wildest dreams did he think that the kind of corruption he'd unleashed would enable the covering up of the murder of his wife. But that's going to be the irony of it, because the police who had been more than willing to suppress labor, the police who had been more than willing to cover up crimes, if they were involved with those who were rich and powerful, suddenly are more than willing to cover up a crime that's connected with Stanford University, and that's one of the great ironies of the whole story to me.
Why do so many people want Jane Stanford dead? Is this because she's just a terrible person to be around? Is it other interests? I never knew Jane Stanford, but all I can say is that
There were a lot of people who hated her, who were very close to her. She treated everybody as if they were an employee, and really she treated them as if they were a servant. As Bertha Byrne, who was with her for a very long time, one of the things Bertha Byrne said is that she ruled through her money. She had no illusions about the power her money gave her, and she intervened in people's lives constantly in order to get what she wanted. And as she became more and more religious and more puritanical as she got older, very often the people she was reacting against would be other less powerful women like Bertha Byrne, women like her female servants, women like the undergraduate women at Stanford University. She is somebody who intervenes in other people's lives and things that we would think were none of her business, and people at the time did too. She was extraordinary. This isn't my imposing modern standards on Jane Stanford. It's the people at the time thought this was an extraordinary way to act. And, in the university side, she did the same thing. She intervened in academic affairs. She intervened in what could be taught, how it was going to be taught, what university faculty could say, what they couldn't say. That she was somebody who put her finger in every pot. And very often she got a great deal of resentment for it.
There was also interest by the university that it was a natural death, and rather than seen as a suicide, because the money is a big part of this, and the money that Jane Stanford had that would go to Stanford University after her death is a major part in this. Tell me about that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, the major reason that Stanford University will intervene is that Jane Stanford's death by murder threatens to have a trial. And if there's a trial, it's going to throw open all of the difficulties around the endowment of the university and what Jane Stanford wanted to do with her money and her will and in the various trusts that she established. None of that can be good news for Stanford University. There's a trustee named George Crothers who had spent much of his life trying to protect the university, and he saw this as a disaster. So if that happens, a trial is going to be disastrous. But equally disastrous is going to be suicide, because suicide in the early 20th century means that the person who committed suicide was not in their right mind, that they in fact were mentally unstable. And if you're mentally unstable, then all the legal documents you're signing are going to be suspect, particularly if stories come out that you're signing these documents on the advice of ghosts, and to put it mildly, ghosts lack legal standing. This is not going to work for Stanford either. So the best thing they can get out of this is not suicide, certainly not murder, but she died a natural death. And George Crothers, one of the things he's going to do is, sketching the edge of the law, is going to rush her documents through probate. There's never going to be a full probate. There's never going to be a full examination. And he's going to get them through, because the last thing in the world George Crothers, who's a trustee, wants to see is any examination of the financial affairs of Stanford University.
In your investigation in this, is there anyone who ever comes out and says, "Hey, this is crazy. This was a murder, and we need to treat it like this"?
Yeah, the people who say it are going to be in Hawaii. The people who are going to say it are going to be Fremont Older, who's a crusading newspaper editor in San Francisco, who says this whole thing reeks to high heaven. This is what's going on here. I can't tell you exactly what happened, but I do know this investigation is a sham. And the other one is going to be George Crothers, but he will only say it privately. I mean, George Crothers will admit until the 1950s that Jane Stanford was murdered. He puts it in his correspondence. But he also will say that no good can come out of examining it. George Crothers will help with the cover-up. So even people who knew that she was murdered, who knew the investigation was a sham, they put the greater good of Stanford University ahead of uncovering the murder of Jane Stanford.
Is this kind of thing, I'm sure it's not normal, because we're talking about abnormal circumstances around wealth and who these people even are, but sort of in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is it normal for homicides, just sort of be like, it's not that important? I mean, she's a woman. Do you think that plays a role in this?
No, I don't think her being a woman played a role in it. I mean, the part that surprised me initially, poor people's deaths occur all the time. That's one of the things that people will say. Well, if she'd been a poor woman in her 70s, nobody would pay any attention to this. But she's a very rich woman. She's one of the richest women in San Francisco. The This does happen. And the reason is it's not that different from now. At a certain point in these Gilded Age families, the person is no longer the important thing. The fortune and the legacy is the important thing. And so what has to be protected, and this is, I think, how university officials would rationalize it. Jane Stanford is dead. No matter what else has happened, she's dead. She's not coming back. Stanford University lives on. If we investigate this, if we push this through, it can only hurt the university. And indeed, it might end the university as we know it. Because Jane Stanford, at the time of her death, was considering turning Stanford University over to the Catholic Church. So Stanford is on very precarious grounds. So I think the rationale for people like Crothers was the Stanfords did at least one good thing. They established this university. We can't let this university die. And if the price is that we don't investigate Jane Stanford's murder, we'll pay the price.
So it would have been like, what, Santa Clara University, which is run by the Jesuits?
Yeah, we would have merged it with the Jesuits. She wanted the Jesuits to come in and rule it because at the end of her life, she's undergoing what's a sexual panic. I mean, she believes that there's going to be rampant promiscuity on campus if women are allowed to have the kinds of freedoms that men have on a college campus. She becomes terrified about what young women are doing at Stanford University. She tries to get rid of them. Crothers points out, no, it's written into the university's endowment that this is going to be a co-ed university. You can't break this contract with the state. She thinks, well, I'll establish a separate college. Maybe I'll send them all to Mills College. And then she thinks, well, I'll just turn it over to the Catholic Church. I'll turn it over to the Jesuits, and we would run it the same way as a Catholic university.
Stanford University, as you mentioned, was founded as a co-ed university. Was this unusual at the time?
It was. It was, and it's one of the things that Stanford, in its usual statements now, is very, very proud of, and rightfully so. But what they didn't leave out is the middle phase of this, where Jane Stanford tries to get rid of all the women on campus, and it is Jane Stanford, and her allies in this are the Catholic Church, but it's Jane Stanford who's after it.
And Stanford's been covering it up ever since. I mean, in a way, right?
Cover up can be a strong word. What Stanford does is what Bertha Byrne does. They just ignore stuff. If it doesn't fit the Stanford story, Stanford does not talk about it. And that's the way these powerful institutions work. We're not going to talk about it.
We keep mentioning the Gilded Age, and sometimes I'm guilty of bringing up these terms without really explaining what they are. You're a historian of the Gilded Age. What was the Gilded Age? Okay,
the Gilded Age takes its name from a Mark Twain novel, which is one of the worst novels Mark Twain wrote, but it's a wonderful title. It's the Gilded Age. What Mark Twain was referring to was the period following Reconstruction and would extend into the early 20th century. And it's a time which on the surface seems to be a period of great prosperity, great advancement, scientific and technical advancement, great growth. But if you go beneath this gilded surface, what you found is rot and corruption. So that becomes the metaphor for what's going on here. And it also means that the people who are going to symbolize the age are the gilded part. It's going to be the tycoons, the people who run these large corporations, the people who amass wealth on a scale that Americans never saw and would never see again until our present period, which is often called the Second Gilded Age. It creates the greatest economic disparities, leaving out slavery, which is leaving out a lot, in American history. And so this is the meaning of the term. And that means that the Stanfords are going to be wonderful symbols of the gilded part of the Gilded Age. Beneath that is going to be a state in great turmoil, a state with huge social problems, huge racial problems, and in which the booms that take place in the economy are going to be matched by equally great depressions and recessions.
As a Gilded Age historian, do you think calling this moment now the Gilded Age 2 is an apt comparison?
Yeah, it's no comparison is going to be exact, but we're confronting a whole set of structural problems which are very, very similar to what went on in the late 19th century. And I could spend the rest of our time here just detailing the parallels, but the parallels are there, and it goes well beyond wealth.
Why did California have to adopt a constitutional amendment to make Stanford University legal?
Because all of the founding documents of Stanford University violated the California Constitution. I mean, Leland Stanford made the university a corporation that would exist in perpetuity, but Stanford, California clearly said no corporation can endure more than 50 years. He wrote trusts in such a way that gave power to the trustees, which were not allowed under the California Constitution. He created a governing structure which was blatantly illegal under the California Constitution. He set up financial arrangements for funding the university, which violated the California Constitution. And George Crothers, at a certain point, decided that it was far easier to change the Constitution than change Stanford University. So that's what they did.
Again, Leland Stanford's former governor and a former senator. He knows he's doing this. He just doesn't care.
You know, I've studied Leland Stanford. I don't even know what Leland Stanford understood. I mean, Leland Stanford was not the shrewdest guy in the world. What he did know, he was really rich and he was really powerful. And what the university runs into trouble for is Leland Stanford and his associates took money from the federal government, a loan which they were supposed to pay back, and they refused to pay it back. If you refuse to pay back the federal government, how important is it that we're now violating the California Constitution? If I even know what the California Constitution says, I'm just not sure. But he did know from lawyers and others who should have known that, in fact, what you're doing is blatantly illegal. You can't do this. You can't at least give us the pretense of drawing up documents founding this university, which make it a legal entity.
And he just didn't care, or do you think he didn't have the lawyers there? Obviously, he must have had lawyers.
He had lawyers there, but the lawyers there are going to be sycophants. And so, when you go back and look at who drew up the documents, Stanford claimed credit for it, but Stanford claimed credit for everything. And Stanford was technically a lawyer, but he was a very unsuccessful lawyer and not a very good lawyer. So when I look at those documents, all I can tell you is the documents are illegal. Stanford University, thanks to George Crothers, knew the documents are illegal. And yet they persisted until Crothers convinced them that they needed to get the Constitution changed.
Richard White, how does one go back to investigate a murder that happened 118 years ago?
You know, it turned out to be much more difficult than I thought. And one of the things with my brother Stephen White, is actually a crime novelist. And so he's written these sort of crime novels. And at a certain point in the story, I started consulting him, both how to construct a story, which is not going to be like a usual history, but is much more like a murder mystery. But also because I ran into a grave problem, which is nobody seems very interested except me in solving this murder. So my original idea was, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back there and I'm going to find a detective, or I'm going to find a private investigator. I often thought of it as, and indeed I read a lot of noir novels. I'm going to find Philip Marlowe or somebody who might be a little shady, but is really interested in getting to the bottom of this stuff. And I'm just going to follow them and I'll tell the story of the person who's investigating. I never found that story. I found a guy, Jules Callendon, who's a private detective who's put in charge of the Stanford case, who cooperates with David Starr Jordan. He was hired to cover up the murder. He wasn't hired to solve the murder. And he does a pretty good job covering up the murder. I looked at the police department. The police department is people who are largely bought off. And as I say in the story, I think actually they did uncover the murder, who the murderer was, and then they made sure that nobody was going to follow those tracks to uncover it themselves. So with that, I had to start doing it. And what I began to do is just doing what detectives do, or what I was told detectives do. First of all, whoever did it is the three things you have to establish is they had to have motive. So I began to look at all the people with motives. And then it seemed to be half of San Francisco had a motive to kill her. So that really wasn't narrowing down.
In and outside of her house, right?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much people in the university, anybody who worked for her, people who she had financial dealings with. There were a whole series of people who had plenty of reason to be angry with her. But they had to have the means. And so I had to have somebody who had the means to get strychnine, and getting rat poison was not much of an issue. Anybody in San Francisco could have gotten rat poison, but pure strychnine, that was hard to come by. You had to sign a poison book, or you had to have inside contacts to be able to get pure strychnine. That is not an easy task. So that narrowed things down more. And then you had to have the opportunity. You had to be there. Somebody had to physically be there to put the poison in the bicarbonate of soda, which could have happened in Hawaii or could have been placed in the bicarbonate of soda before they ever left San Francisco. And then they had to, be around as the stuff was administered. They didn't have to be around, but they had to have been able to plant the poison. So that's where I started to go. I began to investigate it by narrowing it down. Okay, who has the motive? Who has the means? Who has the opportunity? And it was the kind of thing that eventually kept me up at night, especially during COVID, because the major mystery for me is how do you go from rat poison within 6 weeks to putting in pure strychnine in a precise dose? I was positive, for reasons I won't go into here, that it was the same person, but that person had taken a master course in poisoning in the last 6 weeks. So it's getting to that key, and I think I found that key. But getting to that key, at that point, I became confident that I had who the murderer was.
Is this who the police thought it was?
I think so. I think, in fact, the police and the private detective knew who it was, and they made sure that that was going no further than them.
And you think this is a quintessential Gilded Age story? This fits into the Gilded Age?
Oh yeah, this is what the Gilded Age, the Mark Twain stuff. The Gilded Age was about money. What matters in America is money. What matters in America is great fortunes. What matters in America is no longer the old sense that, well, fortunes will last a generation or two or go down. Fortunes will continue to go. And in this case, there is no direct heir to inherit the fortune, but there is Stanford University to inherit the fortune, to create the legacy of the Stanfords. And so I think it was about protecting the money. And protecting the money is something that certainly both politicians, the police, and Stanford University all could understand. And that, I think, is the key to what happens to Jane Stanford.
Maybe even something the Stanfords themselves would understand.
Yeah, I think Jane Stanford would have understood it. I mean, Jane Stanford pretty much knew the power of money. And that's the irony of the story, is that Leland Stanford corrupted San Francisco and it ended up covering up the death of his wife. Jane Stanford got all of her power through her fortune, and her fortune is essentially what is going to make sure that nobody investigates her death.
Richard White has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about his book that's now out in paperback. It's called Who Killed Jane Stanford? A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University. Richard White is Margaret Byrne Professor of American History Emeritus at Stanford University. Richard White, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I enjoyed it too.